In this video today, I want to talk about one of the most overused terms in software sales, and that is the acronym of API, or Application Programming Interface. In today's world, it's very difficult to find any sort of software product that doesn't advertise APIs within their product description. And the reason is, it sells. But I want to talk about why that's the case and what an API actually is, and how we can talk about it in a couple of different ways. To avoid making this video completely abstract and boring, I'm actually going to bring in an example of how we might use an API in the real world. I've been programming for several years now, and I have the skill set to be able to do this, but I'm going to show you how in just a couple hours, is how long it took me, we can write a program using an API that will read the text off of images. In other words, we're going to use the power of artificial intelligence and APIs to do something that would require me to write a ton of code, but we're going to do it in just a couple of hours. Don't worry though, I'm not going to throw a bunch of code at the screen that doesn't make any sense. I'm just going to walk you through the high-level concept of how we can apply an API in the real world. I created this video for the complete beginner that's learning to code, or even someone who's just trying to understand this term better. And speaking of, if you want to learn to code, make sure to hit the subscribe button, give this video a like, and turn on the notifications to see videos just like this in the future. For the rest of this video, I want you to think of an API like a car owner's manual. So you know that thing you shove in the glove box you don't really read ever again? Well, that is a good analogy for us to think of as an API. And I'm going to explain exactly why right now. To paint this picture a little bit, let's say that your front left headlight goes out one day and you notice it, you realize that, oh, I got to fix this before I go drive at night, otherwise I'm going to get stopped and maybe get a ticket. Well, the question is, how do I fix that? And furthermore, what light bulb do I need to put in there to replace it? At this point, you've got about two options. The first one is you can go to your auto parts store and ask the representative to help you figure out what bulb you need to buy and help you install it. The second option is to read the manual. And in true programming fashion, we are going to choose the second option and read the manual. If I open up my car's manual, I see a big diagram that shows all of the different lights on the car. And if I look at where the front left headlight is, I can identify that it's the number 2 light. And then if I flip to the next page of my manual, I can see exactly what type of bulb that we need for that headlight. Now, in this case, very consistent with how programming is, the answer is not always the most straightforward. And in this case, we have to understand, well, do we need HID lights or halogen lights? In this case, since this isn't an automotive tutorial, we'll just assume that it's halogen lights, and I actually just changed my light bulb, so I know this to be a fact. In the case of using halogen lights, it says that I need a 12 volt, 55 watt part number H11. And if I type that into AutoZone's website, I can get the product on my screen and actually purchase it right there. Reading through the car manual is not exciting, but it has some very important implications. So let's imagine a scenario where, let's say that Toyota manufactured 10,000 Toyota Corollas in 2015. And this time in 2015, they installed 2,500 of them with 12 volt, 65 watt light bulbs. And they installed 2,500 with 12 volt, 35 watt or something like that. And then the remaining cars had a mixture of those light bulbs that it could accept. If Toyota did that, it would be an absolute nightmare for everyone. And every time you brought your car, your 2015 Toyota Corolla, into the mechanic shop, they would have to actually open the car up and figure out what light bulb is in there, and they couldn't even look it up in the manual. And this is where the APIs come in, because the car manufacturers, although we don't generally think of them as understanding APIs, have a very good understanding of what an API is trying to accomplish when they created that car manual. Although a car manual is not a perfect analogy for an application programming interface, it does get the concepts across quite well. By creating that car manual, or what we're calling an API, it allows the end user to have a much better experience. And it allows the end user to not have to jerry-rig something, come up with a custom solution every time they need to fix something in their car. And most importantly, it allows that end user to benefit from the complex engineering and design that the manufacturer had to go through to create that car without understanding everything beneath the surface. Secondly, by defining an API for that car, it allows the manufacturer to kind of offload and outsource some of the replacement part manufacturing. So if they have a defined API, they don't have to create all of those replacement light bulbs. They can, basically say, here's the specifications, now someone else go create that and sell it. And that's why you can buy a replacement light bulb from several different vendors, and you don't have to actually go to the manufacturer to get it. Using just this car manual analogy, we can actually understand a lot of the properties of an API. The first property of an API is that it is simple. Now, when you're an end user driving a car, you don't want to have to go through a 20-step process to replace the light bulb. The API is simple. It says, open up this part of the car, take the light bulb out and put a new one in. It's very simple, it's easy to use. The second property of an API is that it is backwards compatible. And basically what this means is that if you produce a 2015 Toyota Corolla that takes a 12 volt, 55 watt replacement low beam headlight, then you always know that a 2015 Corolla is going to have that exact light bulb. You're never gonna have the case where the manufacturer goes back after the fact and updates some of the cars from 2015 to have a different type of light bulb. In that case, you just create the next year's model, the 2016 Toyota Corolla. The third property is that an API is predictable. You want to know that if you read in the manual that you need a 12 volt 55 watt light bulb, that if you buy that and put it into your car, it's going to work. The last thing that you want is to be told something and then find out later that that's not actually what you needed. Number 4, an API follows standards, well, at least usually. And in this case, a lot of the car industry uses, just a small set of specifications for low beam headlights. And the reason for this is because if you're out there, as a car manufacturer, and you create a car that only accepts a very, very specific type of light bulb, then you're gonna have a hard time, getting that specific light bulb to sell in a bunch of different auto parts stores, especially if you're the only car on the entire planet that uses that specific light bulb. The fifth property of an API is that it is well documented. You don't want to have an API that, basically you can't figure out how to use it. So in this case, we're talking about a car manual, which is the API for the car. And if the car manual is missing a bunch of pages and it has unclear instructions, then it's going to be a lot harder for you and a mechanic to actually fix that car. Since we're going to be talking about APIs from so many different angles, I want to give you at least a general definition, or at least how I think of an API. So what I have written down as my definition of an API is that a software API can be thought of as a user manual that allows developers to do something useful with a third-party software or hardware without knowing the inner workings of that software or hardware. So take this back to the car example. The user manual, or our API, allows us to use the complex engineering beneath the surface of that car in a very simple way. And we can do the same thing for third-party softwares or hardwares given a specific API that allows, someone like me who knows how to code but doesn't necessarily know how to code a certain thing to use that certain thing. I think every developer has a slightly different definition of an API, so hopefully that one made sense to you, but we're going to be referring back to that throughout the rest of this video. The first angle that we can talk about APIs from is different levels of abstraction. And since I'm trying to make this video for someone just learning how to code, I want to take a step back and understand what that word abstraction means. And again, we can go back to this car analogy to understand it. So if you are in your car how much brain power does it actually take to put that car in drive or put it in park? Well, obviously it doesn't take a lot of brain power, and you can be having a full conversation with someone while you're doing it. Now, if you were thinking about all the different things that went on when you put it in park or in drive, then you obviously couldn't have a conversation. But those details have been abstracted away from you so that your user experience is better. We can follow this chain of abstraction all the way down to the most detailed levels. So at the highest level, we're just looking at a stick that you can put in park or in drive. But if you take it one level of abstraction lower, you have to maybe understand how automatic transmissions work. And then if you wanted to take that one abstraction lower, you might have to understand, okay, what are the different component parts of an automatic transmission? What type of metals are these parts made of? And then if you take that even further to another level of abstraction, you get down into, okay, how do we actually get those metals from the earth? But to drive a car, you don't have to be an expert in any of these things. You don't have to be a car mechanic. You don't have to be an expert in geology or anything. You just have to know how to put it in park and how to put it in drive. So that's what I'm talking about when I say different levels of abstraction. It's basically talking about, how detailed are we getting with the process we're talking about. At the highest level of abstraction, you might hear, the CTO of a company saying that, our company uses APIs to connect our backend infrastructure. And when they say that, they're just talking about APIs in a very, very general sense. They're not specifically talking about any one API. If we get a little bit less abstract than that, you might say something like, oh, my productivity app uses the Google Calendar API to schedule events from within the app. So that's a little bit more detailed, and then you could even get further detailed, less abstract, and talk about APIs, from the level of a function. So if you write a specific function with your code, that function is going to take certain inputs and it's going to give you a certain output. So what we would call the API for that specific function is the inputs and the type of data that you can input into the function, and then the output and the type of data that function outputs. And that's what we would call the functions API. As you can see, depending on the level of abstraction that we're talking about an API from, you might hear it spoken about a little bit differently. The second thing that we have to talk about, or the kind of different angle that we can discuss APIs from, is the standardization of an API. So I want to bring this up just so that as you get into coding a little bit more and you start seeing these different standards, you can recognize them. So some of the common API standards you might see is a REST API, an RPC, or a SOAP API. And these are just standards, just like we talked about with the car. There's usually some sort of standard for different, car light bulbs. You're not going to get a whole lot of different variations of light bulbs across different cars. It's just easy to have that, industry standard. So with APIs, these are kind of the industry standards, and they allow us to design APIs in a repeatable manner, and it allows someone like me, who's just a developer trying to use different APIs, to have a lower learning curve. So all I have to do is learn the standard, and then I can go to a bunch of different API documentations and understand them a lot quicker than if they were all designed a little bit differently. The final way that we can talk about APIs is according to their classifications. And I could go down, a bunch of different roads here, but I'm just going to stick with some of the most common classifications. The three that I have identified as probably the most common that you'll see as you're learning to code is an open API, a closed API, and an internal API. An open API is going to be anything that is in the public domain. So just because I say open doesn't mean that it's free, but usually, you can use it for free at some level. And a good example of this would be something like the Google Calendar API, or a bunch of different Google APIs that they have created. in order to use their services. And it makes sense because if you've got, an app like a Google Calendar app and you want to adopt a bunch of users to that, you would be incentivized to open up your APIs so that other developers can create their own apps that connect in with it. And the more integrations you have with your product, obviously the more users you're going to attract. So that's the reason someone or a company would create that open API. Now, if we move over to a closed API, or another way of saying that is a proprietary API, this is going to apply to something like, say the Salesforce API. Now, Salesforce sells a proprietary product to large corporations and medium and small sometimes, and they need an internal API, or a closed API, not an internal API, a closed API to connect their clients to their product. And the last thing that they want to do is sell a product that can't be customized. And one great way to customize a product is allow the company you're selling it to write their own integrations into your product. And they do that by using your APIs. And then finally, we have internal APIs, which is just going to describe anything that within a company or within an organization, you've written different connections between your systems. So at a lot of large corporations, they'll have tons of different source systems that generate different types of data. And you have to have APIs written to allow all of those different source systems and the data supply chain and all of that kind of stuff to talk to each other. Otherwise, you're just going to have a bunch of isolated systems that don't talk to each other, and you can never have that unified view of your company. I think at this point we've talked about this enough to generally grasp what an API is. And so now let's solidify this a little bit with an actual example. Before we do this, I want to just recap what an API is. So as we've been talking about, there's tons of different ways to talk about it, different layers of abstraction. You can have different classifications of that API and so on and so forth. But when we boil it down, an API is just some sort of interface, as we talked about, application programming interface, that allows someone who doesn't understand a certain software or hardware to use that software or hardware. In other words, if you've got some company that specializes in artificial intelligence and machine learning, and they've created this software that basically reads text off of a picture, we don't have to know how to implement that to actually use their software, as long as they provide us with a well-documented API that we can kind of connect into their product with. And in our example, we're going to do just that. We're going to use the Google Vision API, which, just as I said, is an artificial intelligence or machine learning software that basically takes images and can do a bunch of different analysis on those images. And in our case, we're going to do some textual analysis, but you can also do face recognition and logo identification from a picture and all sorts of cool stuff with this API. Like I said, I'm not going to take you through every line of code that I wrote here, but I'll take you through the general process that I went through to understand this API and eventually use it to create what I'm about to show you. What you see on the screen is a little Angular app that I created that connects in with this Google Vision API. And all I have to do is take an image link anywhere on the internet, and I can paste that link into the text box and click Analyze. And when I click that Analyze button, what it's going to do is make a call from the Google Vision API, which is going to run all of the code that Google wrote that I don't care anything about. It's going to run that code, it's going to analyze the picture, and it's going to give me a specific output. And that output that I'm getting is a bunch of text that Google Vision API has basically read off of that picture. To actually implement this little app, all I had to do was go on Google Vision API's documentation, read through their quick start guide, which basically gets your development environment set up, gets you set up with all their authentication, billing, and stuff like that. And then from there, I just read through the documentation, figured out which API function that I need to use to, analyze the text on an image, and then I actually implemented that specific function. And so you'll see that it's only a couple lines of code that I'm writing, and that those couple lines of code are exposing a tremendous amount of functionality implemented by the Google Vision API. This is just one specific example of how we might use APIs to make our lives easier with software. And as I said, we can have, multiple different types of APIs. In this case, I'm using an open API, and I'm implementing a very specific part of it. But you could get much more complex with it, and you can even write your own APIs. So hopefully in this video, you've gotten a little bit better understanding through this example and also the analogy that I came up with here to understand what an API is and how it's used. Ultimately, you're not going to understand APIs in full until you've actually used them for some period of time. But hopefully this video gets you started, helps you understand that an API is not just one thing, it's many things. And when people talk about it, they are probably talking about it from a different angle than the person standing next to them. But that's it for today. If you liked this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. And don't miss any other future videos that I create in this Learning to Code series. Have a great day, and I will see you next time.